Gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
First of all, the non-delegation doctrine is a constitutional provision indicating that the legislative branch does not have the authority to delegate our legislative authority to administrative agencies. So what the ranking member is suggesting is unconstitutional in and of itself. With that said, I'd just like to provide some very specific statistics from the 10,000 Commandments from 2022 published by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Federal spending surged to $6.822 trillion in 2021. These federal outlays are projected to reach $5.872 trillion in fiscal year 2022. The burden of regulatory regulation is equivalent to 33% of these projected federal outlays. Regulatory costs of $1.927 trillion amounts to 8% of the U.S. gross domestic product, which is estimated at $23.99 trillion for 2021. When regulatory costs are combined with federal outlays of $6.822 trillion in 2021, the federal government's share of the entire economy reached at least 36%. If it were a country, U.S. regulation would be the world's 8th largest economy, not counting the U.S., but ranking behind France and ahead of Italy. The regulatory or hidden tax associated with the regulatory burden exceeds individual income taxes by several billion dollars. If one assumed that all costs of federal regulation flowed all the way down to households, U.S. households would pay $14,684 annually on average in a hidden regulatory tax. That amounts to 17% of the average pre-tax income of $84,000. The regulatory tax exceeds every item in the household budget except housing. That means a typical American household spends more on embedded regulation costs than on healthcare, food, transportation, entertainment, apparel, services, or savings. Trump's total of 2,964 final rules in 2019 was the lowest count since records began being kept in the 1970s and is the only tally below 3,000. During calendar year 2021, while agencies issued 3,257 rules, Congress enacted only 143 laws. Thus, agencies issued 23 rules for every law enacted by Congress. This unconstitutionality index, which is the ratio of regulations issued by agencies to laws passed by Congress and signed by the president, highlights the entrenched delegation of lawmaking power to unelected agency officials. President Biden had the highest number of pages in the Federal Register of over 95,894 pages. In 2021, the Federal Register contained 74,532 pages of regulations. Since 1993, when the first edition of 10,000 Commandments was published, agencies have issued 114,821 final rules. Of the 95,848 final rules issued since the Congressional Review Act passed in 1996 under President Bill Clinton, there's been a revocation of just 20 rules. The Weidenbaum Center at Washington University in St. Louis and the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center in Washington, D.C. jointly estimate that agencies spent $78 billion in fiscal year 2020 just to administer and police the federal administrative apparatus. At the end of calendar year 2021, 2,094 proposed rules had been published in the Federal Register, 272 of them deemed significant, which the federal government defines as those rules having an annual economic effect of $100 million or more. The reality is that we are not being governed by the legislative branch, by the people who are accountable to the American citizens, to those who are elected pursuant to our Constitution and our laws. It is the unelected bureaucrats that are dictating the laws in this country. I support the REINS Act. I support the amendment. It is time that Congress took back its rightful constitutional authority to legislate, and we need to take it away from unelected bureaucrats who are abusing the power that this body has illegally granted to them. I think there's just an absolute fundamental difference in philosophy and a complete misunderstanding on the other side of the aisle as to how agencies actually work. We're continuously hearing about the EPA keeping our water safe and our air safe and things like that. The EPA doesn't keep our water safe or our air safe. Those duties are handled by states and municipalities. The Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't manage wildlife. The states and landowners manage wildlife. Using the EPA as an example, the EPA does not focus on clean water. It instead wields its powers trying to dramatically expand its authority in order to take control over things that it has absolutely no legal authority to manage. I'll give you an example. Under the Clean Water Act, it only applies to navigable waters of the United States. Yet I have had lawsuits with the EPA where they've attempted to define irrigation ditches as navigable waters of the United States and brought enforcement actions against farmers who've done nothing more than clean out their irrigation ditches. That's the problem that we are facing. That's where the courts have had to intervene, is that our agencies have been taking more and more power well outside of the statutory authority that has been granted to them by us. And it's through such things as the Chevron deference doctrine that courts have then deferred to their interpretation or misinterpretation of the statutes that they are allegedly applying. What this law does is it just simply states that the legislative branch will legislate, nothing more and nothing less. The EPA is probably one of the most abusive agencies in terms of attempting to expand its authority and the definitions and the statutory framework under which it is to act. The Clean Water Act is just one example of that, with the effort over the last many years with the EPA attempting to expand what is defined as a navigable water of the United States by redefining what is meant by that phrase. Again, attempting to define an irrigation ditch as a navigable water of the United States. The EPA has repeatedly been informed that they are exceeding their authority in their efforts to do that, as well as under the Clean Water Act. So the one agency that is probably one of the most abusive in terms of ignoring the statutory framework and proceeding with regulations is the EPA. What's significant about that is in attempting to take control over all water in the United States, not just navigable waterways as defined in the statute, or in their effort to expand what the Clean Air Act says, the regulations that they are adopting literally have impacts of not 50 million, not 100 million, but hundreds of millions and billions and even trillions of dollars of impacts on our economy with these regulations. If there was any agency that should be reined in by the REINS Act, it is the EPA. And it's not because Republicans want dirty air or dirty water, it's that we want the agencies to comply with the statutes, and the EPA consistently does not. The EPA is responsible for one of the worst environmental disasters in the history of the United States when they blew out the Gold King mine in southwestern Colorado and turned the Animas River orange. Just please Google Animas River in Orange and you can see the environmental disaster that was created by the EPA that has still not been cleaned up, and no one in the EPA has been held responsible or liable for the disaster that was created in August of 2015. Again, the EPA is responsible for one of the worst environmental disasters for a waterway in the history of the United States. I'm just going to give an example of how guidance is used by the federal regulatory agencies to circumvent the APA and the rights of the American public. In 2019, the USDA issued a 2-page fact sheet that they posted to the USDA's website that required all livestock producers in the United States, all cattle and bison producers, to start using RFID, radio frequency identification ear tags, by January 1, 2023, or they would be prohibited from being able to sell their cattle across state lines. This obviously would have a huge impact on a state like Wyoming, which is a large cattle producer, but we don't have packing plants in the state of Wyoming, so all of our cattle is shipped out of state. This was a 2-page fact sheet issued on a website without notice, no comment period. According to the USDA, the price tag of this requirement to the cattle and bison industries would have been $2 billion. That's how these administrative agencies use and abuse guidance and it absolutely should be included within this, within this bill, within the REINS Act. I again appreciate the inclusion of the word guidance. This is another area where Congress has got to oversee what these agencies are doing and prevent them from being able to abuse their power in the way that they have repeatedly in the past. With that, I yield back.